All right, let's move on to the next question here. This is a good one. And I'm not just saying that. I know sometimes I do that. It's just like habit, but I like this one a lot as well. This individual says, I have bad congestion and occasionally take Sudafed. Can I train? Is it dangerous to take on comp day? So maybe potentially yes, dangerous to take on competition day, depending on where you're competing, like what organization. So this is pseudoephedrine, that's Sudafed. This directly stimulates alpha adrenergic receptors in your nose and in your respiratory mucosa, also in your and beta adrenergic receptors in the bronchial tree. Basically, when people take this, they have like a stuffy nose, if they've had a cold, if they got sinusitis, allergic rhinitis, stuff like that. And yeah, it helps you breathe better, decrease mucus production, and all this other sort of stuff. Now, all of that's well and good, can be therapeutic in those settings, but it is prohibited in competition use. So if you're subjected to WADA testing, it is prohibited to use in competition. You can use it outside of competition. You don't need a therapeutic use exemption, a TUE, to use it. Like, look, if you get a cold in training or whatever, and somebody pops up at your gym to test you, like whatever, you don't need a therapeutic use exemption for that. But if you get tested at your meet, you could potentially pop positive and have a higher level. There's like a threshold level. I think it's 150 milligrams or something like that in the urine. And so then you would apply for a retroactive TUE. But there have been reports of people who have tried to do that, but their level was so high that they were like, nah, bro, you're tested positive. You got a 2-year ban for taking Sudafed. So maybe dangerous, not from like a health risk standpoint. It actually, there's actually some decent evidence. I didn't expect to find much on this, but they have taken a lot of like healthy people, given them Sudafed, and then had them exercise or do some sort of performance thing and see like what happens. And so, yeah, it increases your heart rate in healthy individuals, but it doesn't really increase performance. It seems to be about half the amount of performance increase people get from taking caffeine. So whether or not this should be on the banned list is a whole other thing. I think WADA and their rules and stuff is more about the potential abuse, which people can and do for Sudafed. I think the bigger risk I think about is, why is somebody taking this? And further, like, is it a good idea to be training in a public place if it's something that's infectious, from like a public health risk? And I don't know, how does that strike you? Do you think I'm like being overly cautious, overly risk averse, or what?
Yeah, this is a person, whoever asked this is somebody I'd want to have a bit more of a conversation with them about, to get a sense mainly of the nature of their symptoms and especially its chronicity, meaning how long it's been going on for, because Sudafed is not a drug that I would recommend somebody use for chronic nasal congestion. The most common cause of chronic nasal congestion is just going to be probably regular old seasonal, allergic rhinitis, which has much better and safer treatments that you can use long-term to manage chronic nasal congestion from allergic rhinitis. But if it's not allergic rhinitis, then there are still other things that can make you have a sensation of congestion in your nose that would be worth detecting, certain like polyps and other sorts of things that would be worth taking a look in there, right? But there's actually no situation where I'm recommending somebody chronically use pseudoephedrine long-term for something like this if it's not been evaluated or figured out why the person's experiencing it. So that would be my first recommendation, is like, hey, have you tried other better and safer medicines for allergic rhinitis before using something like this? It's interesting you mentioned that there's even a modest performance benefit, I guess, from stimulant effects. I'm also curious. I'd be curious, when they do their drug test, are they actually directly testing for pseudoephedrine, or is it that this drug cross-reacts with other things that also have stimulant type effects, other things from the like ephedrine family? That would be not surprising to me as one of the ways that you could pop positive from just cross-reactivity from others. And then the last thing I'll say is pseudoephedrine is the type of Sudafed that I believe has been moved to behind the counter, quote unquote, because it's something that has been used to synthesize meth before. Okay. Whereas now, if you're getting something just off the shelf and it's labeled as Sudafed, it's often now labeled as Sudafed PE. That is phenylephrine, which is not the same as pseudoephedrine. And phenylephrine is also an alpha, receptor agonist, but it is worthless for congestion, for cough, for cold, for symptomatic management. There was actually some new guidance, I think, within the past couple of years. I believe it was from the FDA on the general worthlessness of phenylephrine for cough and cold remedies, yet it still tends to be sold and is available over the counter. And so I don't recommend anybody use phenylephrine pills, oral systemic pills of phenylephrine for anything. There are other uses of phenylephrine if you give it in other ways. Usually it's going to be in a hospital setting, so you don't need to worry about that. So yeah.
Yeah, it says under WADA's rules for this that pseudoephedrine is prohibited in competition when its concentration in the urine is greater than 150 micrograms per milliliter. Now, again, to your point, I don't know what exact metabolite they're testing for, but the way that reads to me, I'm like, are they testing just for pseudoephedrine, or it's like known metabolite? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
The last thing I had here, so if somebody was taking this, they had like a cold, right? This is another question I got separately. We'll just lump this together. If someone has an active cold, it's likely to be caused by a virus, if it is in fact a cold. And so any post-viral syndrome, that people can have after they've had a viral infection, can increase the risk of myocarditis. And that's been pretty topical recently. I don't know, if somebody's got a pretty gnarly cold and they're like, should I train? And I'm like, public health risk aside, I think it's likely to be fine, just common things being common. Some people are going to develop myocarditis. I just don't know that exercise while somebody has these symptoms actually does increase the risk of myocarditis. I think it's one of those things that's either going to happen or it's not, regardless of what you do. However, you might identify, in fact, that you do have myocarditis by exposing yourself to exercise, because otherwise you wouldn't know. At least that's how I'm thinking about it. Does that make sense to you? Or
yeah, I mean, that's a hypothesis. I find it plausible. It's infrequent enough that this is certainly not a great concern for me. I think when I get asked this, to your point, it's, are you training in a public gym with an active, febrile illness or something like that, where you're spewing virus everywhere? But if you're training by yourself, like you and I have both trained when we felt under the weather, I think that most of the time we tend to adjust our sessions to a greater degree in that situation, because it's just recognizing, like, I might just mentally or to some extent physically prefer to be active more than not. Yet I also recognize that my body is not in the best position to adapt to a stimulus right now. And so hitting a max effort set or aiming for a particular weight load on the bar or something, that's not necessarily the point of this session, but rather just to move around a bit and feel good. It's okay to sometimes do that. And so that's usually what the path that I take, because I, of course, have maintained a garage gym for a long time. So it's straightforward, even when I don't feel awesome, to get out and move around a little bit. But I'm usually not loading terribly heavy because the stakes are not usually very high. I'm not usually a week or two out from a meet with a cold, trying to hang on to every last bit that I can, and just recognizing, like, this is a much bigger, longer term process. And training hard when you're ready to adapt is better than pushing it when you're not ready to adapt.
Yeah, I like that. No, good summary.